I think it's a critical sugya, it's a fascinating sugya for understanding what does it mean when Yerusha is jointly owned by all the Yorshim, right? So most of the parak focuses on how does Yerusha get from the father or from the Morish to the children or to the Yorshim, whoever they may be. That's the main focus of most of the sugyas. How does it get from point A to point B? This sugya focuses on what's the nature of that bailus in that interim stage before the brothers split up the nechasim. What's the nature of their bailus? Is that like a regular shutvis where each person has like a 20%, 50%, whatever percent stake in the joint property, or is it different? Is the fact that it comes from Yerusha make it different? So it was, and nowadays, Baruch Hashem, we don't have to rely on it so much, but for a very, very, very long time, hundreds and hundreds of years, this was very important halacha l'maisa, this sugya, because the idea of an esrog being jointly owned by multiple people was the norm in kilos throughout Europe. They didn't have enough money. They didn't have enough local produce of esrogim. Really love him also, but particularly esrogim, to be able to have every member of the community have one. So this sugya became critical. In Derech, the Rishonim talking about that very important halacha l'maisa topic, we also got perspectives on how tefusas habayis, the joint ownership of all the Yorshim, may differ from your regular shittas. So let's see the Gemara. The Gemara says like this: Amar Rabbi Barapuna, ha'achan shekanu esrog with tefusas habayis, two brothers who purchase an esrog with tefusas habayis, with the money which they jointly own, they didn't split up the nechasim yet from the father. If one of them now takes this esrog and he yatzabo, it's a funny phrase, yatzabo meaning he wants to be yotzei, he takes it on sukkis and in an attempt to be yotzei the mitzvah, if he could eat it, then he's yotzei. But if he couldn't eat it, then he's not yotzei. What does he can't eat it? It means if the brothers would be makpid that he shouldn't eat it, then he is not yotzei. But if they don't care, if they would say about such an esrog, you could eat it, then even though he didn't eat it, he just took it for the mitzvah, then he's yotzei the mitzvah. And then the Gemara ends with this a little bit cryptic line: "V'davka di'ika," maybe not cryptic. "V'davka di'ika esrog l'chol chad v'chad." But this is only true if each one of them has an esrog of a parish or rimon lo. But I'm not sure what a parish is, some other type of fruit, or a rimon, they're not. Meaning, it sounds like what the Gemara is saying: if each one of them has an esrog and they're not makbid, then he's yotzei. But if they split, let's say there was a lot of fruit, they bought a lot of fruit with their two sabais. They went, they got a what do they call it? The mixed platter, whatever. The grab bag where they got like one different type of fruit from the store with this money from two sabais. So it was a fair chalukah. This one got an esrog, this one got a rimon, this one got a parish. Even so, he's still not yotzei. So already from the Gemara, it's the question of like, are there two requirements here? Is this one requirement? Is it hakpada? If it is hakpada, then why do you also need? What's your question? Yaakov, you want to just ask? Sorry, it'll be easier. Does it mean? Yeah.
When we say that the brothers don't care if he eats, is that the God before the other brothers even tried filling the mitzvah, or just they wouldn't care if the brother to just take a bite anytime other than this very moment?
Good question. Good question. That might be a machlokas rishonim, right? So the question is, when we say they don't care, that means, maybe I'll reformulate the question, but I think it's the same idea. That means they were already yotzei the mitzvah, so they don't they did the mitzvah already, so they don't need any more esrogim, or it's independent of their being yotzei the mitzvah. They just don't they would have been yotzei already, but it's a more how many are esrogim to go around, as it were. Yeah, so that might be a machlokas. So what's a few questions on the Gemara? Like, are there two standards here? The first one is clearly a matter of hakpada. Is the second one just sharpening the point about hakpada, or is it something else? Why is this a case of achen? what about shutfin, right? That's the main question that we shouldn't really dealt with. There is no Gemara that talks about an esrog shal shutfin. We'll see in a moment the Gemara about stam, an esrog which you don't own, but there's no Gemara. Is this unique to Achim, or is it true for any shutfin who buy an esrog? When I say Achim, let me just, I don't mean Achim who buy something the shutfis. Specifically Achim who buy it with tefusas habayis, right? It's not just the fact that they're brothers, and brothers are less likely to be makbid on each other, but they specifically bought it with a certain type of neches, a certain type of property. Another point. Another point. Okay, let's go to the Gemara in Sukkah. Let's go to the Gemara in Sukkah. So the Gemara in Sukkah. This is on Mem Aleph on the base. The Mishnah there talks about an esrog which is gazul or shaul. So the Gemara there kicks off the sugya over there with just bringing the source. What's the source that you can't use a stolen or borrowed esrog? Okay. Lachem misha lachem. It has to be yours. It has to be yours. Lahoti is a shaul. That's a gazul. So the clear din from the Gemara Sukkah is that if you want to use somebody else's lulav, and presumably all dalminim are the same, then it needs to be a matana. And our Gemara, the previous sugya, the next sugya in our Gemara is that matana maslahachir, shema matana, that also counts. But it has to be a matana, it has to be a full matana. You have to be makne one to the other. Now, it doesn't say in this Gemara, what about shutfit? What about if there's joint ownership, right? Gazul is stolen, shaul is borrowed. It doesn't say what would be the case if shutfin used it. At the same time, from our sugya, you see that it's not merely the classic case of theft or she'ela, but even something else. So how does our sugya fit into that sugya over there? How does it? Our sugya is clearly an extension, but in what way? If we look at Rashi, if we look at Rashbam by us, ve'im lav lo yatsa. So Rashbam says dichsiv. So what's the source that I can't use an esrog in tfisis habayis specifically? Ulkachtem lachem mishalach. So far, he's quoting the Gemara Sukkah. Sheyehei kulo shalo v'lo miksam mistasa shalo. What? That's not. There's no Gemara like that, right? Rashi just invented a drasha, right? Sheyehei kulo shalo v'lo miksasa shalo. That's not the lashon of the Gemara in Sukkah, right? The Gemara said lahotis hashal etagazul. So what's Rashbam saying? Right? You could understand in one of two ways. Either Rashbam is not adding a new drasha. He's not saying beyond Shaul and Gazul, there's another psul called Miksaso Shalo. The Rashbam is rather saying, you see from our sugya that using an esrog that's not 100% yours is a type of gzela or a type of she'ela. What's she'ela? What's gzela? Somebody else has bailus. He didn't give the bailus to me, and I'm using that esrog to be to the mitzvah. So that's the same as achen shakanu, which was habayis, and the same presumably as shutfis, right? It's not full bailus. So if it's not full bailus, mimela, it's a type of gazul. It's a type of shaul. Okay, that's one way to understand what Rashbam is doing. And beyond Rashbam, there's one way to understand our sugya. Like, how does our sugya relate to the Gemara Sukkah? It's not a new din as much as an expansion of what we already know. We already know that Shaul and Gazul are puzzle, so we're going to expand our understanding of what Shaul and Gazul mean. The alternative, and that understanding obviously fits in very well with the lashon of the Gemara Sukkah, that there's a psul cheftza in an esrog which is Shaul or Gazul. It is like that. An alternative, and this maybe fits the lashon of the pasuk better, right? Because the lashon of the pasuk is ukachtem lachem. It's a positive statement. It's not a negative statement. It's not saying it doesn't say in the pasuk, don't take an esrog hagazel, don't take an esrog hasha'ul. It says a positive, it must be yours, right? So the alternative is that Rashbam is telling us it's not that this esrog is gazel or sha'ul, but gazel and sha'ul are just examples of an esrog which is not fully yours. The real din is not a negative lahotzi as hasha'ul as hagazel. It's not a psul as much as there's a positive din that you need to own your esrog. You need to be the total sole bailim on your esrog. What does it mean not to be the sole bailim? So that's a very important question. What's called sole bailos? So the easy example would be sha'ol or gazel, where there's an actual, you have certain, if you're a sha'ol, you have kinyanim, you're allowed to use it for all sorts of things. A gazlan has kinyanim in different ways, but in both those cases, there's a competing bailos, right? There's a competitor. There's the mafkid and there's the nigzal, who are both very clearly competing for bailos. Our sugya tells me you should know that there are other cases where you're not yotzei because of a bailos which is not competing in the same way as a nigzal or a mafkid who will sue you in court to take back the item, but there's a competing bailos in a percentages. You have rights in it, but not total rights. Those are two ways to understand what's going on in our sugya, and two ways to understand Rashbam, who's appealing to a new drasha, which we don't really find in the Gemara in Sukkah. Who's the first one who brings up the question of Shotfes? The Rif, right? The Rif in Sukkah. So he quotes. He's talking about that Sukkah on Mem Aleph, and in the context he quotes our Gemara, right? And he says. So he has a slightly different girsa in the Gemara, right? Ours, so he has rimon lo yatsa. Sorry, that is our girsa. I apologize. I didn't mean a different girsa. The Rashbam, if you saw the end of that, the Rashbam says, not that the Rashbam ve'im lav says, no, sorry. The end of that Dibur Maschal ve'im lav lo yatsa. He says it's a perish al shotim, a little bit sharp. It's a perish al shotim, but Rif included that. I think that might be very important. Again, one of our questions was, are there two standards here or one? For Rashbam, clearly there's one standard. It's hakpada or not hakpada. And what that does, according to Rashbam, presumably, is based on our two possibilities. Either when there's no hakpada, so I'm not a gazlin, there's no shame gezel if there's no nigzal. The nigzal is, it's yours, it's you to use. There's a chiddush in that you don't need hakna'a. The Gemara in Sukkah said, "Elad came nasal matana," so here you don't need that. Alternatively, if there's no hakpada, then again, on our second side, there was never a shaila that whether it was gazel or not. But if there's no hakpada, then that somehow takes away the competing bialim. There's only one bialim, not multiple bialim. Now, I don't mean competing bialim, but the plurality of bialim, not plurality, the multiple bialim. There's no riboy bialim if no one's mak. But again, we'll come back. So the Rif says, he quotes our sugya, he quotes the line that the Rashbam thought was perish al shotim, and then he says, Ushma mina, you see from our sugya, Dahani betray the zavni lulava b'shutfis lo nofak bei chad minayu yidei chovasei b'yom akama ad yav echad lechavei manos delay v'lo lo nofek. So the Rif says, you see from our sugya that two people who buy a lulav together, neither one is yotzei, unless on the first day at least, right? It was only on the first day of Sukkot that there's a psul gazel. The din of lachem mishal lachem is only true on the first day. So neither one is yotzei until each one gives the other his chelek b'matana. That's what you see from our Sukkah. Meaning, okay, from the Gemara Sukkah alone, we didn't know what the din would be by shutfin. From this Gemara Bava Basra, so then I now see that shutfin are not yotzei unless they're makna one to the other. So the critical question in the Rif is he saying that ach and shakanu are shutfin? It's all the same, or saying, look, Achen are different than Shutvin, but L'chal Pachos, you see that if even Achim aren't Yotzei, then Kol Shekein Shutvin. If you say that Achen is what in Shutvin, and it's all the same, so then you have the question of why the Gemara give the case of Ach Shekanu Ezer with Tfisus HaBayis, right? That's an extreme case to say any Shutvin. If you say that Achen and Shutvin are different, then you have to explain like what's different about them. Is it, in what way is the Shuttis distinct? So who takes a stance on this explicitly? The Meiri. The Meiri is very clear in our Sugya that it doesn't have to be Achen who are Kona b'Tfisus HaBayis. He says, b'Tfisus HaBayis, o me'eze momen ha'meshutaf b'neihem. Right? Brothers who buy an esrog with their joint money. It could be their joint money because they all went into business together, nothing to do with Yerusha. The Meiri doesn't see any difference between Shutfes and Tfisus HaBayis. But it's not so clear in the Rif. And if you look in the Rambam, so the Rambam is very clearly coming off the Rif, and I'm not sure how to read it. Let's read it together. So the Rambam begins with the din of Shutvin, right? The Rif quotes the Gemara, with the Achin, and then he says, you see from here the din of Shutvin. The Rambam flips it around. So first he tells the din of Shutvin that you need to be makneh b'matana. Then he tells me, then he tells us, our Gemara, which is Achim can rely on Akpada, but if there's Akpada, then you need a matana. And he says that's only true if there are esrogim. But if this one has an esrog and this one has a parish, or they all together bought a mixed bag of different fruits, then you're not yotze with this esrog until you get a matana, right? Hakpada is not sufficient. So the Rambam has two cases, and the question is, what's the difference, right? It's clear that in sometimes the matana is necessary, and sometimes it's not. Sometimes you can rely on the lack of hakpada. So what's the difference? There's two diyukim really in the Rambam that imply two different possibilities. Obviously, one diyuk is shutfin versus achen, right? That might imply there's a distinction between shutfin and achen. Right? If shutfin are kone, then you need a full matana. But if it's achen, it's tfisus habayis, you don't need matana. It's enough to have a lack of akpada. And then he has an additional t'nai that there has to be enough esrogim to go around. But otherwise, you need matan. The alternative is that the chiluk is actually shutin and achen. The chiluk is between one esrog versus multiple esrogim, and this is how the Rif learned the Gemara, and it's meduik in the Rif too. The Rashbam thought the line of esrog v'chol chad v'chad was totally extraneous. Perish shel shotim. The Rif. He is machalik. If you look clearly, he says, and then he gives a case of Hani betrayed the Zavni Lulava b'Shuttis, one lulav. And the Rambam reflects that, right? The Shutin are konen esrog b'Shuttis, the Achim are konen esrogim b'Tfisus HaBayis. Right? And that's what the Rambam's chiluk at the end. The Rambam says, and even Achim, if they only bought one esrog, there's other fruits, but if there's only one esrog, then you need hakna. What's the chiluk? L'chora, it becomes like a stam das type of thing. If there are multiple esrogim, this might get back to Yaakov's question. For what reason are the achim not makbid? So the Rashbam takes a very practical approach. You look at the Rashbam in Diran Esrog at the very end. He says, not at the very end, the last 5 lines. If the brothers aren't makbid on each other, then this one who took the Esrog to be Yotzei, if he could eat it without even asking them, can go. How does he know he could eat it? Sheish Esrogim harbe b'Tfisus HaBayis, o sheyimtzu harbe Esrogim be'ir, o shekvar yatzu in tzichem la'od. 3 possibilities. There are multiple esrogim that they all own together, or they only own one esrog. But you can go out to the store and get more esrogim, or they're Yotzei already. It's a very practical standard of do they care or not. For the Rambam and the Rif, it's pretty clear that the distinction is if there are multiple esrog or one esrog. If there's only one esrog, then it doesn't matter that you could go out to the store and buy esrogim. It doesn't matter that this one was yotzei already. It's inherently, it's not my esrog. You can't say, this is my esrog to use, and they'll get their esrog. The esrog is jointly owned. Now, that it might, boil down to a practical nekuda that you can't assume that they're not makbid, but that stam lack of akpada is ironclad based on the number of esrogim that there are. Who passes this way? The Mishnah Berurah seems to. The Rambam is quoted by Shulchan Aruch basically verbatim. The Be'er Halacha quotes from the Lavush, who basically says that there's no chilek between Achim and Shutvin, and all that matters is, are there multiple esrogim or only one esrog? So again, according to that, basically what you have is a Gemara in Sukkah, which tells me that you can't use an esrog which is stolen or which is borrowed, and our sugya expands upon that point. It tells me that even if it's mishutaf, if it's jointly owned, then it's still puzzle because you don't have total rights of hishtamshus, I guess, and that lack of total hishtamshus makes it a shtickle like a gezel, or maybe lacking total violence. But don't worry, the solution to that is lap dafka you need a hakna, because if you have multiple esrogim that are all owned by multiple people, whether they be achim or shutvin, then lack of hakpada is sufficient, right? Because it's not like gezel and she'ela where you don't own it. Here you do own it, just other people potentially have competing claims of bilus. So as long as they're not makbid, they're not going to claim their bilus, then there's no problem to use it. That would be basically how our sugya is understood, and that's the chiddush that our sugya provides beyond what we already knew from Masechah Sukkah. There's maybe some other chiddushim other Rishon talk about, even if the esrogim aren't exactly the same value, some are more mehudar, some are less mehudar, still lack of hakpada can be assumed if there are multiple esrogim. Fine, okay, that's very nice. The Shiltei Giborim quotes from the Riyaz a totally different take on the sugya. That it could be that's pshat in the Rambam. I'm not convinced, but it definitely is a critical perspective on the sugya. It really ends up being on the whole pack. So Shiltei Giborim there in Sukkah quotes from the Riyaz. He says like this: Ella. He starts by quoting our sugya and lack of hakpada. If they're not makbid, then you can use the esrog. And you don't need hakna. He says, "Shalo no markin ela ha'achim shekanu b'tfisas habayis." We only say this by brothers who bought it b'tfisas habayis. Al sh'ar shutvin afal pi she'enim makpidin zeh ein yotze b'rishon b'esrog shel shutvis ad she'iten echad lechalko b'matan lechavero b'ferish. So he's not saying dafka because they only bought one esrog. It's clear. He's not being mechalek, Shutvin who bought one esrog, it doesn't work. That's like the Rif implied. He's saying, no. You could have Shutvin, let's say you have Shutvin who go into business together, right? They're Daled Minim. So they have a warehouse full of esrogim. So can one of them take an esrog? He owns it. There are hundreds and hundreds of esrogim, and we love it in the warehouse. He's not preventing any other Shutvin from being yotzei. So does the Shulchan Aruch? No, he's not yotzei. Why? Lack of akpada? No. Lack of akpada only works for brothers or kone b'tfisas habayis. It doesn't work for shutvin. And he ends b'chein b'nei hakneses shekanu esrog ulav b'shutvis, and similarly people in a shul who jointly buy an esrog ulav ein yotze b'hen eshiknu chalka b'ferish. They need to do a real hakna one to the other. Fine. So he doesn't explain why is this so, right? He learned our sugya. It's relatively meduyuk that our sugya only spoke about achim shekanu b'tfisas habayis. He gave a very specific example. It didn't say shutvin. It said a very specific example of brothers, not just brothers, but brothers who brought with a specific type of property, with the nechasim they received from their father, and they didn't yet divide it up. But he says that's only is helpful. So what's the pshat in that? Why would that be that we'd be mechalik? So you could say it might be the pshat is that as long as they're not, that when it comes to shutfin, if they're not makbid on each other, they're still bailim. And that shame bailim makes it as if I'm a gazlan, I'm a shoel, right? We go into business together, and we have a warehouse full of hundreds of dollars. Tachlis, I'm not the sole proprietor of the warehouse. There are other people who have bailas, and even if practically speaking, they're not going to press charges on me, like don't mind that even if I would eat it, they wouldn't mind. Tachlis, they're still bailim. So I'm using their esrog, right? It's sha'ul. It's still sha'ul. It's a kain a gezel. Masha ein kain with achem b'tfisus habayis. Maybe the pshat is that we don't look at how do we perceive tfisus habayis? What does it mean? You started out with a morish. You start with a father who he's the sole bailim on the property. When he dies, what happens? We don't say that his bailas got split into, let's say, 5 different new bailases, right? There are 5 children who are sharing the property. We don't say his bailas now got split into 5 bailas. No. His single bailas was passed down as a single bailas. That's called tfisas habayis. Until they split up the nechasim, there's one ownership. Anybody who's a shame, anybody who's part of that family, so by virtue of his status as a Yorish, he is the bailim. He is the bailim. If people would be makbid on each other to use it, so then now you're saying that there's multiple Yorishim who want this specific property, and they're clashing with each other, and then you run into a problem of it's like shekel gezer, something like that, because somebody else wants it and has legitimate claim to it. So and I'm using it, so I'm taking it from him. I'm like a gazan, I'm like a shoel in that sense. But if nobody else is makbid, so then it's only mine. If nobody else is makbid, it's only mine, because I'm not being opposed by a competing claim of violence. So when Achim have an esrog mitfisas habayis, it's not a regular shutfis. Maybe this is how the Shulchan Aruch understands it. It's not regular shutfis where people put in a certain amount of money and therefore require an equivalent stake in property. Rather, there was one bilas that came from the father, went down, this split up into different streams, different yorshim, but it came down as one. It remains one, as long as they didn't split it up. And each shem yorish, each person with the status of yorish, has a claim to everything, basically, as long as nobody else claims it. Now, as long as nobody else is claiming what he wants, so he can claim everything. Now, normally what happens is that everybody claims everything, and then they split it up. But if nobody really cares about him taking this particular esrog, then he's the sole yorish on that. He's not trampling on anybody else's bilas. A slow alternative to that, I think, has to be said for the Rashbash. The Rashbash is Reb Shlomo ben Shimon, I think. Reb Shlomo ben Shimshon. His father was Rashbat, so Reb Shimshon ben Tzemach Turan. He was from the great postgame of North Africa. So after the Jews, basically, the Jews in Spain, we all know 1492 as the year that the Jews left Spain. But the truth is that 100 years before that, in 1391, there were terrible persecutions, and that's basically the end of the great golden age of Spain. So the Ran lived through the period through 1391. In the generation after him came the Rivash and the Tashbates, who were in North Africa, Spanish exiles in North Africa, and then the Rashbash is the son of the Tashbates. So the Rashbash, he deals with a fascinating question. It's like a classic shaila. You have a party, and there are multiple guests at the party, and one guest decides that he wants to be Mekadesh, the daughter of the other guest. Obviously, there's wine involved, and one of the discussions that the Rashbash deals with later in this tshuva, not in the part I gave you, is the effect of wine on Chalus Kedushin. And he paskins very clearly, based on the Gemara, based on the Rambam, that until a person is at Shechruso Shalot, meaning totally wasted, until that point, everything you say and do can and will be held against you in the court of law. You're Chayav Onshim, and your Kiddushin is the Kiddushin, and everything is Chal. So that's not a Shela. In that sense, it's Chal. The better question is that Ruvain, who's Mekadesh, Shimon's daughter, by giving Shimon a cup of wine. But whose wine is it? The Baal Bayis is. So he begins by saying that it's Pasha that's fine, because when the Baal Bayis put the food on the table, when he put the wine on the table, his clear intention was that anybody who wants can take, right? That's obvious. There was a case a bunch of years ago in Eretz Yisrael. Somebody made a kiddush, and they had bottles of soda on the table, and there was at that point there was a sweepstakes for the caps, right? They have there's a code on the bottom of the cap. So somebody at the kiddush brought a cap home, and he won. And there's a whole shaila: who really wins the prize from RC Cola? Is it the person who made the kiddush or the person who had the bottle cap? And the Pasha Psak was the one with the bottle cap, because the guy at the kiddush, he could make an announcement if he wants. Everyone's allowed to have soda, but the bottle caps are mine. But the Pasha is not like that. The Pasha is you put food out for you're feeding people. So you are basically mafkir everything on the table. Whoever wants can take. There's no hakpada. So the Rashbash says, in this case, for sure, the kedushin should be chal based on that, because the wine belongs to everybody. If you look in the paragraph that begins with the word teshuva, so he says in the middle of the third line, she'im haya hayayin shel kol hashotfin. Below suffix she'en lechavim makpidim. Im yesh echad kos shel yayin yos mechaver. Let's say all these guys they chipped in together to buy wine to the suda. For sure, nobody's makpid if one guy drinks a little bit more than another. Or if one guy would give somebody else a drink. So Ruvain, he picks up this cup, it's his, because he could have drank it or give it to somebody else. It's as if they divided up the wine. It's as if he said, this is my chelek in the joint wine. So he says, if it's true that in the case of shutfis, there's ihakpada makes it that it's not gazul, right? And esrog hagalzel puzzle, and by there being no hakpada, it's not gazul. So too by kedushin is not chal if the kesef kedushin is stolen. So lack of hakpada makes it not gazul. But he makes a simple equation. If it's not gezel for an esrog, it's not gezel for kedushin. So far, so good. So then he asks the question we started with: why does the Gemara talk about achin? At Tfisabayis, why not achin or shutfin? Standard in Shas, achin and shutfin are the same. He doesn't explain. He just lays it out there. Esok shal shutfin pasal. Aval in kedushin ein chiluk bein sheyi hayayin shal achin mitzabayis kolmar miyushas aviyam sheshin menu bein sheyi sheshar shutfin. So what the Rashbash just he made a very interesting chiluk and he didn't explain himself. When it comes to kedushin, there's a problem. You cannot be mekadesh begezel. Mekadesh begezel ein kedushin kedushin. Let's say it's kesef shel shutfin. That's fine. Let's say it's kesef shel achin. That's fine, as long as there's no hakpada in both cases. When it comes to an esrog hagalzel is puzzle. An esrog shel shutfin also puzzle, even if they're not makbid. But esrog shel achim is kosher if they're not makbid. So what's the chiluk between achim and shutfin, right? So it's like the riyaz who's machalik between achim and shutfin. However, what's clear from the Rashbash, and it's clearly pshat in riyaz, it's just clear in the Rashbash. It has to be the chil cannot be in the chalos shem gezel, right? It's clear that if no one's makbid, it's not gezel. Because if it was gezel, kiddushin would be hal. When he says esok shel shutfin pasal, he doesn't mean an esok shel shutfin is like an esok hagazel. Because if it was, then it wouldn't work in kiddushin. Elamai, it has to be like this. It has to be that really anybody who's a shutter or a brother with tefisas habayis, if no one's makbid, then it's not gezel. You can't call it gezel. No one's makbid. I use it. I have every right to use it. Just like I could juggle it, just like I could eat it. I could also be mekadesh with it. I could also give it to somebody else. So that's totally fine. That's no relationship to the concept of gezel. However, when it comes to an esrog, beyond the psul chefza of esrog hagazol, there's a positive requirement of exclusive bilas. That's clearly how the Rashbash learned our sugya. Why did the Gemara use the case of achim and not shutfin? Because beyond the question of esrog hagazol and esrog hasha'ol, which we learn from Sukkah Mem Aleph, there's another tier of bilas called exclusive bilas. Now, it's not a separate makor. It's all coming from the word lachem, but lachem we darshan in a positive sense to mean you need exclusive total bilas in order to be yotzei daled minim. What's unique about tefisas habayis is that when it comes to shutfis, so even though there's no shayla of gezel, I have every right to use something. I'm not exclusive. But when it comes to achim, there's exclusivity. How does that make sense? How could there be exclusivity? There are multiple brothers. How could there be an exclusive bilos when there are 5 bailim who all have a connection to this particular property? So the pshat is similar to what we said before, just slightly different. When the father dies, what does it mean that he's molish? It means all of his nechasim, it's still unified. It's still his. The father is still the molish. It's still nikra al shmo after his death. The process of Yerusha, like we've seen in our parak a few times, ben kom tachas aviv. The son, he rises up in the place of his father. It's not a hakna'ah. The father doesn't need to give the nechasim to his child. The son just assumes the bilas that the father already had. That's simple when there's one child. What if there are 2 or more? So you might have thought that they jointly all together assume the bilas and it's split, we said before. You might have thought, like before, the chayr doesn't split. Prior to Chalukah, there is no split. It's still all the father's nechasim. Anybody with the status of Yoresh can claim those nechasim as his own and is exclusive of his own. For this particular neches, he's come tachas aviv and nobody else has come tachas aviv. Particular esrog, for this particular lulav, this son is come tachas aviv. It's his only. If nobody else is makbid, nobody else makes a claim to it, it is exclusively his, and nobody else will be the yoresh of those nechasim. And in that way, achim are totally different from shutfin. And not just achim, but achim and tefisas habayis are totally different from shutfin, because there is no competing bilas. Mimela, that's how we understand why the Gemara used after the case of achim, why the Rashbash, why the Ri'az are mechalik between achim and shutfin. What's the difference between an esrog, between daled minim and kiddushin? And now we understand. I think it's amazing yesod for the process of Yerusha as a whole. Not just like bread as that way, but that even when there are multiple banim, that each one individually is kam tachas aviv in his specific way, and the other ben will become tachas aviv as well for the other nechasim. It's not that they are all together tachas aviv, and then they have to just split up, for practical purposes, who gets what. No, which nechasim go to which guy is an expression of who's kam tachas aviv for which nechasim. It's very related. It's shaykh to a lot of other yisodos in our parak. But just one example, Rav Saraf on Tuesday, he gave shirkoli about Rabbi Zuckerman ben Baroka. For those of you who were there, I don't know if anyone listens online. I don't know if it is online. It's online if you want to check it out. But he was talking about how does it work that the father can designate a particular Yoresh? What does that mean? So it's mamish this, that if you have once you have a Shem Yoresh, right? Rabbi Yochanan ben Baruch's Chiddush only works for a ben ben. So you have 5 banim, and they all could be the Yoresh, but the father designates that for a particular neches, only one of them has the Shem Yoresh. That's mamish. Look at the lashon of the Ran on Rabbi Yochanan ben Baruch. It's on the Mamakomos that Rav Saraf gave out. It's the lashon of the Ketos in describing Rabbi Yochanan ben Baruch. It's exactly this point. For particular nechasim, I can appoint a particular Yoresh, right? So that it's not that I'm just dividing up. It's not that the father's dividing up the nechasim that are going to get divided anyway. It's that he exclusivity make a particular ben become Tachas Aviv for a particular property that he has. That's just one example. It's a lot of things, but that's just the yesod that comes out of our sugya. An important yesod for Yerusha, that the process of Yerusha, it's not a hakna'ah from father to child. It's not even a hakna'ah from the father to the children as a whole. It's not the children as a whole dividing up joint bilos. Rather, it's each one expressing his relationship to his father as a Yoresh for particular nechasim, and the other claims those same nechasim, then it's exclusively his, and Mela, he's Yotzei Lachem on Sukkot. Shkaya.